Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. Let's get one thing straight right from the start. Maximum security in space is a joke. Not the setup to a joke, mind you, but the whole punchline, delivery, and awkward silence afterward when nobody laughs. Because here's the thing about locking up the galaxy's most dangerous beings in a floating metal can. Somebody, somewhere, always forgets to account for the statistical anomaly. The wild card. The thing that doesn't fit the threat assessment matrix. In this case, that thing wore a faded jumpsuit, had calloused hands from years of hauling cargo through the void, and answered to the name Annie. The Nalqueth detention vessel, Wrath's Mandate, drifted through a patch of space so contested that even the salvage crews avoided it. Smart money stayed away. Dumb money got conscripted. And Annie? Well, Annie had committed the cardinal sin of having a busted navigation array at exactly the wrong moment in exactly the wrong sector. 3 months ago, she'd been minding her own business, hauling medical supplies to some backwater colony, when the Nalqueth intercepted her. Espionage, they'd called it. Unauthorized presence in restricted military space. The kind of charges that sounded official enough to stick, but vague enough to mean whatever the prosecution needed them to mean. Now, the Nalqueth were, to put it mildly, not the galaxy's warm and fuzzy types. Think praying mantis if the mantis stood 8 feet tall, wore biological armor plating that could shrug off small arms fire, and had a cultural philosophy that boiled down to might makes right, and we've got a lot of might. Their ships looked like someone had taken a cathedral, made it aggressive, and then taught it to hate. The Wrath's Mandate was no exception, a floating fortress designed to hold the kind of prisoners that made other prisoners nervous, which made Annie's presence here absolutely hilarious, if you had the kind of sense of humor the universe tends to cultivate in the deeply cynical. She sat in cell block Theta, subsection 9. Her accommodations were, charitably speaking, Spartan, a bench that doubled as a bed, a waste recycler that functioned with all the dignity of a sad mechanical wheeze, a force field instead of bars, because apparently even alien prison architects watched the same sci-fi vids. The walls were some kind of dark alloy that swallowed light and gave back nothing but the occasional reflection of her own face, looking about as thrilled as someone waiting for a late bus in the rain. The cell next to hers housed a Vexrani assassin who'd killed a planetary governor with nothing but a spoon, and what witnesses described as unsettling patience. 2 cells down, a Quellon war chief who'd led a rebellion that lasted 3 years and cost 2 systems their economic stability. Across the corridor, something that didn't have a name in any language Annie spoke, but that the guards referred to as the one we don't feed after sunset. And yet, somehow, improbably, the other. Prisoners avoided her section of the block. Not obviously. Not with the kind of fear that came with territory disputes or dominance displays. It was subtler than that. The way predators gave space to something they couldn't quite categorize. The way you'd cross the street if your hindbrain started screaming warnings your conscious mind couldn't articulate. Annie, for her part, seemed utterly oblivious to this. She spent her days doing push-ups, humming songs from Earth that probably hadn't been popular for 2 centuries, and watching the guard rotations with the casual interest of someone observing clouds. The interrogations had stopped after the first month, mostly because Kalmesh, the station commander, had run out of questions that Annie answered with anything other than variations of spectacular unhelpfulness. Kalmesh was a model Nalqueth specimen, rigid posture, mandibles that clicked when he was thinking, and an air of martial competence that would have been impressive if it wasn't so thoroughly marinated in bureaucratic exhaustion. He'd conducted wars, he'd negotiated truces, he'd personally led boarding actions that became case studies in military academies. And he could not, for the life of him, figure out what to do with one human woman who treated imprisonment like an extended layover. The latest interrogation session had occurred 5 days ago. Annie had been escorted, uncuffed because, honestly, what was the point, into a room that was trying very hard to be intimidating. Low lighting. The kind of chairs that were uncomfortable by design. A table between her and Kolmesh that was bolted to the floor, as if someone might weaponize furniture. Kolmesh had steepled his 4 primary manipulator limbs, a gesture that translated roughly to, "I'm being patient, but my patience has limits," and clicked his mandibles twice. "I will ask you one more time, human. Why has your government not attempted contact, not demanded your return, not even filed a formal inquiry?" Annie had leaned back in her chair, the picture of someone settling in for a good story. "Oh, they'll show up eventually, probably with a strongly worded letter and a fruit basket. You know how it is. Forms to file, committees to consult. Someone's got to approve the letterhead. Bureaucracy is a universal constant, Commander. It's probably the one thing every species in this galaxy has in common. That and a distrust of telemarketers. We do not have telemarketers. Give it time." Kolmesh had made a sound that the translation matrix rendered as a sigh, though it sounded more like hydraulics failing. "You are either very brave or very foolish. I've been told I'm a stunning combination of both. Really, it's one of my most marketable traits. That, and I can parallel park a cargo hauler in under 6 minutes. This is not a joking matter. Commander, with all due respect, everything's a joking matter if you have the right attitude. I'm locked in a cell with beings that could tear me apart. I'm 3 months away from my last decent meal, and I'm pretty sure the recycler in my cell is plotting against me. If I don't laugh, I'll just spend all day thinking about those things. And where's the fun in that?" The commander had studied her for a long moment. And here's where it got interesting. Because Kolmesh wasn't stupid. Rigid, yes. Bound by protocol and tradition, absolutely. But not stupid. And something about Annie's absolute lack of concern was starting to register as wrong in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "You show no fear," he'd said finally. "Should I?" "Most beings in your situation would." "Most beings aren't me." And there it was. That simple statement, delivered with the kind of casual certainty usually reserved for observations about weather or the quality of lunch. Most beings aren't me. Kolmesh had dismissed her after that, troubled in a way he couldn't explain to his staff and wouldn't have admitted to himself. Now, 5 days later, Annie was back in her cell, doing unarmed push-ups and counting in what sounded like 3 different languages. The guards had changed shift 20 minutes ago. The prisoner in the adjacent cell, that Vexrani assassin with the spoon incident on her record, was pretending to sleep but was actually listening. Annie knew this because she'd been pretending to not notice for the past week. The ship's ambient noise had changed about an hour ago. Subtle shift in the engine harmonics. A different rhythm to the ventilation. The kind of thing you only noticed if you'd spent years in space, learning to hear what a ship was telling you. Something was about to happen. Annie finished her 100th push-up, stood, stretched with the languid ease of someone who had all the time in the world, and then sat on her bench with her hands resting loosely in her lap. Empty hands, relaxed posture, and the ghost of a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. In cell block theta, subsection 9, Aboard the Nalqueth detention vessel Wrath's Mandate, surrounded by the galaxy's certified nightmares, a human woman waited. And if you'd been paying attention, really paying attention, you might have noticed that everyone else in the block had gone very, very quiet. Because predators know, on some fundamental level, that bypasses logic and speaks directly to survival instinct, when they're in the presence of something that doesn't fit the normal rules. And Annie? Annie was about to remind the galaxy that humans had rules all their own. Prison breaks follow a predictable pattern, narratively speaking. There's the planning phase, lots of whispering and significant glances. The execution phase, where something inevitably goes wrong, but the protagonists adapt. And then the aftermath, where everyone either escapes gloriously or dies trying. It's formulaic, comfortable. The kind of story arc that's been done to death across 1,000 worlds and twice as many entertainment feeds. Which is why what happened next, aboard the Wrath's Mandate, was so deliciously off-script. The first sign of trouble was the lights. They didn't go out dramatically. No sudden plunge into darkness with convenient emergency lighting. Instead, they stuttered, flickered, went through a sequence that spelled out in very technical terms, someone's hacking the power grid, and they're not being subtle about it. Annie looked up from her bench, tilted her head slightly, and made a small sound that might have been amusement. The second sign was the alarm, a wailing klaxon that the Nalqueth had designed to be biologically distressing across multiple species' hearing ranges. It achieved this goal admirably. The sound was the auditory equivalent of someone dragging rusty nails across your nervous system. The third sign was the sound of force fields deactivating in sequence, a cascading failure that started 3 blocks over and was rapidly approaching theta section. Now, here's where we need to talk about Balthoom. Balthoom was a nethix, which meant he had 4 arms, each capable of crushing steel, skin that secreted a mildly acidic compound when threatened, and a personal body count that had its own database entry with footnotes. He'd led a mercenary company that had toppled governments for fun and profit, mostly profit, until he'd made the mistake of trying to topple one government that had friends in the Nalqueth hierarchy. Hence, his current accommodations. Balthoom was not by nature a patient being. 3 months of imprisonment had done nothing to improve this aspect of his personality. So when a coalition of like-minded prisoners had approached him with a plan, he'd listened. When they'd explained they'd bribed a guard and compromised the ship's security systems, he'd nodded. And when they'd asked him to lead the breakout, he'd agreed with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for natural disasters. The plan was simple: disable the force fields, overwhelm the guards, seize the command deck, and negotiate their release. Simple plans were good plans. Complex plans had too many points of failure. What Balthoom hadn't planned for was the human. The force field to Annie's cell deactivated with a sound like reality taking a brief coffee break. The shimmering barrier just ceased to exist, leaving nothing between her and the corridor except approximately 3 meters of open space. Annie didn't move. The Vexarani assassin in the next cell was already out, moving with liquid grace toward the sounds of fighting. The Quelon war chief was bellowing something that sounded like a battle cry in a language composed entirely of consonants. Further down the block, various nightmares were streaming out of their cells with the kind of enthusiasm you'd expect from beings who'd been caged for months. Annie remained seated, hands in her lap, watching the chaos with the mild interest of someone observing interesting weather patterns. Balthoom arrived 60 seconds later at the head of a group of freed prisoners, all of whom were armed with improvised weapons, stolen guard equipment, or, in one case, what appeared to be a piece of wall paneling sharpened to a point. He was breathing hard, his forearms slick with that acidic secretion. And there was a look in his multiple eyes that spoke to the kind of violence that wasn't thinking clearly anymore. He saw Annie's open cell and made a decision that would have been tactical if it had involved any actual tactics. Hostage, leverage. The human would be perfect. He gestured to two of his followers, a hulking grindle and something insectoid that clicked when it moved, and they approached Annie's cell with the confidence of beings who'd forgotten to consider why she might still be sitting there. Annie looked up at them, still didn't move, still had her hands in her lap, still wore that ghost of a smile. The grindle reached the entrance first, ducking slightly to fit its bulk through the doorway. It opened its mouth to say something threatening, got as far as half a syllable, and then just stopped. Frozen, every muscle locked in place except for its eyes, which had gone very wide and very focused on Annie. The insectoid thing clicked twice, confused, then skittered forward. It made it 2 steps into the cell before it too went absolutely still. Balthum, who'd been watching this from the corridor, felt something cold slide down his spine. He'd felt this before. Once. On a battlefield where he'd faced something that shouldn't have been able to kill him but nearly did. That primal recognition that bypassed thought and went straight to the part of the brain that kept you alive by telling you when to run. He pushed past his frozen followers, all 4 arms tensed, acid dripping from his knuckles, and stepped into the cell. Annie met his eyes. "Hello," she said pleasantly. "You seem to be having a busy night." Balthum tried to access the part of his brain that did intimidation. It had always been reliable before. He'd terrified planetary governors, made seasoned warriors reconsider their life choices, reduced hardened criminals to cooperation with nothing but his presence. "You will come with us," he growled. And his voice did that thing where it resonated in 2 octaves simultaneously, a neat biological trick that usually made prey species go limp. Annie's smile widened fractionally. "Will I? You are a hostage. You will ensure our safe passage." "That's a fun idea. Here's a question, though. Do I look like someone who takes orders well?" Balthum's combat instincts, honed over decades of warfare, suddenly started screaming at him. Not metaphorically. Actually screaming. Every predator sense he possessed, every danger recognition subroutine burned into his DNA through generations of survival, was telling him in very clear terms that he was making a mistake. The human was sitting down, unarmed, unaugmented as far as he could see, smaller than him by half. Should have been easy to intimidate, easy to grab, easy to control. Should have been. "I have killed hundreds," Balthum said, and he was disturbed to hear a note of something that wasn't quite confidence in his own voice. "I have destroyed ships with my bare hands. I have survived battles that became legends. I have bathed in the blood of my enemies and worn their defeat like a crown." "That's nice," Annie said. "Are you done?" And that's when Balthum noticed her hands. Really noticed them. They were resting in her lap, loose, relaxed, fingers slightly curved, not tense, not prepared for anything, just empty and still and utterly, completely calm. Nothing kept its hands that empty unless it didn't need them to be full. Nothing kept its hands that still unless it knew, with absolute certainty, that when they moved, they'd move fast enough and precisely enough that preparation was redundant. Balthum had seen weapons in his time. Guns, blades, exotic energy devices, biological horrors. He knew what danger looked like. This was different. This was watching someone hold a detonator and realizing the bomb was already inside you. He took a step back. His followers, still frozen, made small sounds of confusion. "You are wise," Annie said softly, to listen to that voice in your head. The one that's telling you I'm not what I appear to be. Most people ignore that voice. They rationalize it away, tell themselves they're being paranoid. But you've survived this long by trusting your instincts. Balthum took another step back. Then another. His acid secretion had stopped, his body recognizing on some level that aggression here would be suicide. "What are you?" he whispered. Annie's smile never wavered. "I'm nobody important, just a cargo hauler who took a wrong turn. But I'm also someone who's been very, very patient for 3 months. And the thing about patience is, it runs out eventually. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave my cell. You're going to continue your little escape attempt. And you're going to forget you saw me. Because if you don't, if you decide to press this, then I'll have to stop being patient. And if you stop being patient, then the universe will have one less warlord, and I'll have slightly less empty hands." Balthum backed fully out of the cell. His followers, suddenly released from whatever had frozen them, stumbled backward as well, eyes wide, breathing hard. In the corridor, another freed prisoner, a Quelon warrior who'd been watching the exchange, stepped forward. "Balthum, why do we not take the human? She is small, weak, valuable for leverage." Balthum didn't take his eyes off Annie. "Did you see her hands?" "Her hands? She kept them empty. Nothing needs hands empty like that unless—" The narrator's voice, if it had been present in physical form, would have chosen this moment to lean in conspiratorially and say, "Unless they're not hands. They're promises. Promises of what happens when empty becomes full, when still becomes motion, when patience becomes action. And those are the kind of promises that smart beings don't ask to be kept." Balthum turned and walked away. His coalition followed, confused but alive. In her cell, Annie remained seated, hands in her lap, humming a tune that might have been older than some of the ship's crew. The force field flickered back online 30 seconds later as the ship's security systems began fighting back against the hack. Annie was enclosed again, contained, imprisoned, and yet somehow, improbably, she looked like she was exactly where she wanted to be. Because here's the thing about predators that everyone forgets. The most dangerous ones don't need to hunt. They just need to wait for prey to realize, far too late, that they've been in the killing zone all along. The prison break continued in other parts of the ship. Chaos and violence and desperation. But in cell block Theta, subsection 9, there was only silence, stillness, and the quiet sound of a human woman humming to herself. The warlords had gotten nervous, and the universe was about to find out why. The prison break lasted another 2 hours before the Nalqueth security forces, displaying the kind of brutal efficiency that had made them a galactic power, put it down with extreme prejudice. Balthum and his coalition made it as far as the secondary cargo bay before they were cornered, subdued, and processed back into detention with additional charges that would keep them locked up until their respective suns went cold. Kalmesh surveyed the damage from the command deck. Mandibles clicking in a rhythm that his staff had learned meant he was both furious and calculating. 16 guards injured, 3 dead. Structural damage to 6 sections. And yet, somehow, impossibly, the most dangerous prisoner on the ship hadn't even left her cell. He pulled up the security footage from cell block Theta, subsection 9, and watched the encounter between Balthum and the human. Watched it again, and then a third time, because surely he was missing something. The human had done nothing. Said a few words. Sat there with her hands in her lap, like she was waiting for transportation. And a warlord who'd earned his reputation in blood and fire had backed away like he'd seen death itself, wearing a pleasant smile. Kalmesh made a decision that was either brilliant or catastrophically stupid, and in his experience, those two categories had a lot of overlap. He went to see Annie himself. The walk to her cell gave him time to think, which was either a blessing or a curse, depending on what his thoughts were doing. The corridor lights had been repaired but still flickered occasionally, casting shadows that moved wrong. The other prisoners in the block watched him pass with the kind of attention prey gives to predators, and he was uncomfortably aware that he couldn't tell if they were watching him or watching where he was going. Annie was doing sit-ups when he arrived. Slow, controlled. Movements that suggested someone who had nothing but time and the discipline to use it. She finished her current set, stood, and regarded him with the same pleasant expression she'd worn in every interrogation. "Commander," she said, "this is unexpected. Usually I have to wait 3 days between visits. Are we moving to a more intensive schedule? Should I prepare questions?" Kalmesh deactivated the force field, stepped into her cell. Behind him, his security detail tensed, but held position. Annie raised an eyebrow. "Bold move. Did you watch the security footage?" "I did. And you still came in here. That's either very brave or very stupid." "You said those categories overlap." "I did say that, didn't I?" "Good memory, Commander. So what brings you to my humble accommodation? Here to ask why Balthum ran like his tail was on fire?" Kalmesh clicked his mandibles twice, a gesture of directness. "What are you?" Annie's smile shifted, became something less pleasant and more genuine. "Now, that's a better question than, why hasn't your government contacted us? See, the first question assumes I'm important to them. The second question assumes I might be important to you. Much smarter. You did nothing. You were unarmed. You made no threats. And yet a being who has killed hundreds backed away from you like you were a singularity waiting to collapse. He had good instincts. I liked that about him. Most beings ignore their instincts, talk themselves out of listening to that little voice that keeps them alive. Not him. He felt something was wrong, and he trusted that feeling." "What was he feeling?" Annie sat back down on her bench, patted the space beside her in invitation. Kalmesh, in what was possibly the strangest moment of his command career, sat down next to a human prisoner and waited for her to explain why she was the most terrifying thing on his ship. "Okay, Commander. Story time. You know about Earth's history, right? The broad strokes, at least. Violent species, barely made it to space without destroying ourselves, somehow unified enough to join the galactic community, but still fragmented enough to be considered primitive by most standards. That is the general assessment, yes. Right. So here's what the assessment missed. Before we got our act together enough for space travel, we spent a lot of time fighting each other. And I mean a lot of time. Thousands of years of warfare, getting progressively better at it, more efficient, more deadly. We weaponized everything. Physics, chemistry, biology, information, psychology. If it existed, we figured out how to kill someone with it. Many species have warlike histories. Sure, but here's the thing that makes humans special. And I promise this isn't the usual "humanity is the best" nonsense. We're not the strongest, or the fastest, or the smartest. What we are is adaptable. We can't breathe underwater, so we built submarines. We can't fly, so we built aircraft. We're fragile, so we built armor. Every limitation we had, we engineered around. And then, during the expansion wars, someone asked a really interesting question. Kalmesh leaned forward slightly. Which was, if we can engineer around our physical limitations with technology, why can't we engineer around them with biology? Not genetics, That's been done. Not cybernetics. Everyone does that. Something else. Something that uses what we already have, but uses it better. Annie tapped her temple. The human brain is essentially a biological quantum processor. It handles an absurd amount of information every second, most of it unconscious. Pattern recognition, threat assessment, spatial reasoning, predictive modeling, all happening in the background while you're consciously thinking about what to have for lunch. So someone very smart asked, what if we could train the brain to do that consciously? What if we could make all that processing power available on demand? That is not possible. It wasn't. But then it was. The target protocol, they called it. A training regimen that rewires neural pathways at a fundamental level. Takes about 2 years of intensive conditioning. Meditation, biofeedback, combat training, stress testing, all designed to teach the brain to shift into a different processing mode when needed. Kalmesh's mandibles went still. Different how? When it activates, when I decide to activate it, my brain becomes a weapon-targeting supercomputer running on pure instinct. I don't think about what to do. I just do it. Reaction time drops to neurologically impossible speeds because I'm not reacting, I'm predicting. Everything becomes angles and vectors and pressure points and leverage. I see 6 moves ahead not because I'm smart, but because my brain has shifted into a mode where that's the default state. That sounds like augmentation. It's not. There's no hardware, no implants, no foreign technology. It's just training, just teaching the human nervous system to access capabilities it already had, but didn't know how to use. And here's the thing that makes it truly terrifying, Commander. It only activates when I perceive genuine lethal threat and decide to engage. Annie's smile was back, but it had edges now. Balthum walked into my cell ready to use violence. My brain registered him as a legitimate threat. The protocol spun up, waiting for me to give it permission. And he felt it. Not consciously, but on that deep, instinctual level where prey recognizes predators. He felt the difference between normal human and human with a loaded weapon system running in her skull. That's why he backed off. His instincts were screaming that if he touched me, if he gave me any reason to decide he was a problem that needed solving, I'd solve him in ways he couldn't defend against. Kalmesh was silent for a long moment. Then, I do not believe you. That's fair. I wouldn't believe me either. It sounds like the kind of story prisoners tell to make themselves feel important. The "you don't know who you're messing with" speech that precedes exactly nothing. But you are suggesting it is true. I'm stating it's true. Whether you believe it is your problem, not mine. Kalmesh stood, paced the small cell, his mind working through implications. If this is true, if humans have this capability, why have we not seen it deployed? Why are there not reports of human operatives with these abilities? Annie laughed, a genuine sound of amusement. Commander, there are hundreds of reports. You've just never connected them because they don't look like what you expect. A human diplomat who defuses a hostage situation before security arrives? A human trader who survives a pirate attack when everyone else dies? A human tourist who walks away from an assault in a station's lower levels when the attackers don't? Every single one filed away as luck, coincidence, unexplained circumstances, because nobody looks at a human and thinks walking weapon system. Until now. Until now. Lucky you. Kalmesh turned back to her, and here's where it got interesting, in that way where interesting means potentially lethal. Because the commander was a being of duty and protocol, but he was also curious in the way that survivors are curious. They test boundaries to know where the edges are. "I want to see it," he said. Annie's expression went carefully neutral. "You want me to demonstrate?" "Yes." "That's a terrible idea, Commander." "Nevertheless, I want proof. We have training facilities, combat drones, non-lethal testing parameters. If what you say is true, you should be able to demonstrate it without anyone being harmed." Annie was quiet for so long that Kalmesh wondered if she was going to refuse. Then she sighed, a very human sound of resignation mixed with something that might have been dark amusement. "All right. But you understand that once you see this, once you know what I am, you can't unknow it. You'll understand why Earth doesn't advertise this, why we let everyone think we're primitive and harmless, because the truth is a lot harder to live with. I accept that risk. Your funeral. Well, not literally, but possibly metaphorically." Which is how, 30 minutes later, Annie found herself standing in the ship's training arena, a space designed for Nalqueth combat drills. The floor was reinforced alloy, the walls could take weapons fire, and hovering in the center, tracking her with multiple sensors, was a combat drone. Not a killing machine, just a training unit. Non-lethal deterrence, rubber projectiles, shock batons. The kind of thing you use to test recruits and keep them honest. Kalmesh watched from the observation deck, along with a dozen officers who'd been summoned to witness this. Whatever this was. Annie stood in the center of the arena, hands at her sides, looking up at the drone with the expression of someone evaluating a mildly interesting puzzle. "Commander," she called up, "last chance to call this off. Proceed." The drone activated its targeting laser, a thin red line that touched Annie's chest. "Standard training protocol. Mark the target. Give them a moment to react. Then deploy deterrence." And that's when Annie's pupils dilated. Her breathing changed, became a different rhythm, slower and deeper, and somehow more efficient. Her posture shifted fractionally, weight redistributing in ways that shouldn't have mattered, but suddenly looked perfectly balanced. And she moved. The narrator's voice, if it could be heard, would say something like, "This, kids, is what we call scientific method meeting cosmic hubris, and it's about to be educational in the most uncomfortable way possible." Annie's movement wasn't fast in the way that augmented beings were fast, all blur and inhuman speed. It was fast in the way that optimization was fast, every motion economical, nothing wasted, each step flowing into the next like water, finding the path of least resistance. The drone fired a rubber projectile. Annie wasn't where the projectile was going. Hadn't dodged, just wasn't there. Because she'd seen the angle of the barrel and calculated where the shot would be before it fired. She was under the drone now, jumping, one hand catching a sensor array, using her momentum to swing up and around. Her foot connected with a joint, a precise strike that didn't damage but did destabilize. The drone wobbled. She was already moving to the next point, hands finding purchase on weapon mounts, feet finding leverage on armor seams. The drone tried to deploy its shock baton. Annie caught the arm mid-deployment, used the motion to spin herself around to its back, and did something with her elbow that looked almost gentle, but resulted in the baton clattering to the floor, detached. 6 seconds had elapsed. The drone was trying to compensate, sensors tracking her, but she was always where it wasn't looking, always moving to the next position before it could adjust. Not because she was faster than its sensors, but because she was thinking ahead of them, predicting what it would do and being somewhere else first. Her hands found a panel, pulled, and suddenly she was inside the drone's housing, fingers finding circuits with the casual confidence of someone who understood machinery at a fundamental level. 2 more seconds. The drone stopped moving, its systems locked, Annie standing on top of it like someone casually waiting for a bus. Total elapsed time. 8 seconds. And through all of it, she'd been humming. That same tune from Earth, something old and gentle and completely at odds with the economically brutal dismantling of a combat drone designed to challenge trained Nalketh warriors. She hopped down, landing lightly, and looked up at the observation deck. Her pupils were still dilated. Her breathing was still in that different rhythm. And she was smiling. "Satisfactory demonstration, Commander," she called up, and her voice had a quality to it now, something that suggested the protocol was still active, still running, still waiting for her to tell it. There was more work to do. In the observation deck, Kalmesh stood frozen. His officers were silent. Several of them had unconsciously taken steps back from the viewing window, because they'd just watched something that shouldn't have been possible. Not impossible in the sense of physics-defying, but impossible in the sense that beings without augmentation, without enhanced reflexes, without cybernetic targeting, didn't move like that, didn't think like that, didn't dismantle combat systems with the casual ease of someone solving a familiar puzzle. Kalmesh's mandibles clicked once, a sound that might have been fear, or might have been respect, or might have been the dawning realization that everything he thought he knew about humans was catastrophically incomplete. Annie's pupils contracted back to normal. Her breathing shifted back to regular rhythm. The smile remained, but now it was just a smile again, not a warning. "The protocol is dormant now," she said, "just so you know. Back to being regular, harmless, fragile human me. The me that can be killed with sufficient force applied in conventional ways. But, Commander, the thing about the protocol is that it activates fast, faster than most beings can process. So, if you're thinking about testing whether I'm really back to being harmless, I'd strongly advise against it." Kalmesh didn't respond, couldn't respond, was too busy processing the implications of what he'd just witnessed. Annie walked toward the exit, paused at the door, and looked back. "Thank you for the demonstration opportunity. It's been a while since I got to stretch, get stiff, sitting in a cell for 3 months. I'll see myself back to my accommodation. Unless, of course, we have more tests planned." She left before anyone could answer. In the observation deck, one of the junior officers whispered, "What was that?" Kalmesh, still staring at the disabled drone, answered in a voice that had gone very quiet and very thoughtful. "That was a human showing us we have been categorizing their species incorrectly. We thought they were primitive because they lacked our technology, our enhancements, our martial traditions. We were wrong. They do not lack those things. They simply do not need them." And in cell block Theta, subsection 9, Annie sat on her bench, hands in her lap, humming that old Earth song, and waited to see what the galaxy would do with the knowledge that humanity had weaponized peace. The ship's AI had been watching, listening, compiling, and now it was making connections that its organic counterparts had been too shocked to consider. It presented its findings to Kalmesh 6 hours after the demonstration, displaying them across every screen in his office with the kind of enthusiasm only artificial intelligence could muster for pattern recognition. "Commander," the AI said in its perfectly modulated voice, "I have identified 83 incidents across 9 sectors involving human detainees or human civilians in conflict situations." Kalmesh, who hadn't slept and probably wouldn't for the foreseeable future, gestured for it to continue. The files appeared: incident reports, security footage, witness statements. A human trader who survived a Vexrani assassination attempt when 6 other species didn't. A human maintenance worker who walked away from a station riot that killed 20 beings, a human passenger who defused a hijacking before security arrived. Each one filed as anomaly, coincidence, luck. None of these reports mention augmentation, the AI continued. None mention weapons. The humans involved were classified as non-combatants. And yet, statistically, their survival rate in lethal situations is 300% higher than baseline predictions. 300%. Yes, Commander. The probability of this being random chance is negligible. Conclusion: there are significantly more humans with this capability than previously understood. Kalmesh stared at the data, feeling something cold settle in his thorax. How many? Unknown. But based on incident distribution and frequency, I estimate thousands currently traveling through non-Earth space. Thousands. Not soldiers, not declared military assets, just civilians, traders, tourists, wanderers, all carrying the same invisible weapon system, all looking perfectly harmless until the moment they weren't. The AI continued, almost cheerfully. Additional observation, Commander. Humanity has weaponized peace. Other species achieved martial supremacy through addition, enhanced biology, superior technology, cultural militarization. Humanity achieved it through subtraction, refinement, absolute efficiency. They made themselves dangerous by perfecting the art of not needing external tools. That's horrifying. That's brilliant, the AI corrected. From a strategic perspective, it's elegant. No weapons to confiscate, no augmentations to detect, no obvious threat markers, just biology optimized to its theoretical maximum. Kalmesh made his decision. Release the human, immediately. Full apology. Return her ship, compensate for lost time, and file the incident as bureaucratic error. And if she refuses compensation, then we thank her for her patience and hope she leaves peacefully. Which is how, 12 hours later, Annie found herself walking through the hangar bay toward her cargo hauler, which had been cleaned, refueled, and probably treated better in 3 months than she'd treated it in 3 years. Kalmesh met her at the boarding ramp. On behalf of the Nalqueth Detention Authority, I apologize for the error in your detention. Your ship has been prepared and all charges dismissed. Annie looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. You know, Commander, most people double down when they make mistakes. Pride, ego, bureaucratic momentum. But you? You chose wisdom. I appreciate that. I chose survival. Same thing, really. She started up the ramp, paused, looked back. Commander, can I give you some advice? Please. When you file your report about this, be honest. Tell them exactly what you saw and what it means. Because the galaxy's going to figure this out eventually, and it's better if they hear it from someone who witnessed it and lived to process the implications. Fear is useful, but understanding is better. And if they don't believe me? Annie's smile widened. Then they'll learn the hard way. Tell Balthum he was smart. His instincts saved his life. Most don't listen to that voice. Those are the ones who end up as cautionary tales. She disappeared into her ship. The engines hummed to life with the sound of something that had been well maintained by guilty mechanics. Kalmesh watched her depart and then received a transmission. Earth's diplomatic corps, formal and polite, thanking him for safeguarding one of their civilians. Attached was a file. He opened it, knowing already that he wouldn't like what he found. Thousands of names, all listed as civilian contractors, cargo haulers, tourists, maintenance workers, cultural liaisons, all currently traveling through non-Earth space. And at the bottom, in text that was somehow both diplomatic and threatening, Earth appreciates the galactic community's hospitality toward our citizens. We trust that this information will facilitate continued peaceful relations. Kalmesh understood. This wasn't a threat. It was a revelation. Earth wasn't hiding their capability anymore. They were making it clear. We're everywhere. We're armed in ways you can't detect. And we've been polite enough to tell you. In her cockpit, Annie set course for her original destination, 3 months late, but no worse for wear. Her hands rested gently on the controls, empty and relaxed, and capable of terrible precision if needed. She hummed that old Earth song and smiled at the stars. Behind her, the Wrath's mandate grew smaller, and with it, the illusion that humanity was primitive, weak, or harmless. Because the galaxy had just learned a fundamental truth. When a human raises their hands and shows you they're empty, they're not surrendering. They're just being polite enough to give you a chance to reconsider. And that politeness? That's not mercy. That's just good manners before the universe's most dangerous predator decides whether you're worth the effort of making a point.